Snow lifted in jagged spirals as the engines grew louder overhead, their distant roar vibrating through the ridge before the soldiers could even locate the source. Boots slid across the frozen chalk as men dropped flat, pressing themselves into the earth with the instinctive precision of those who understood. Visibility meant vulnerability. Cold soil clung to their gloves, grainy and sharp, while the sky pulsed with the metallic beat of wings cutting low across the valley. Breath condensed in tight bursts that vanished almost instantly, leaving nothing but the quiet thrum of fear beneath the rising drone. Mud smeared across one soldier's sleeve as he clawed deeper into the ridgeline, his outline fracturing beneath the uneven texture of stone and frost. No one called out. No one dared shift more than a fraction. Movement felt louder than sound. The squad held to the broken terrain as the shadow of the first aircraft swept across them, a vast, shifting blade of darkness that traced their position with indifferent precision. Engines circled again, closer this time, the air trembling with the weight of unseen eyes searching for contrast against the pale ground. Wind scraped along scattered rubble, lifting dust into thin veils that drifted across helmets and coats, blurring edges, softening forms. Silence expanded around them in a tense, collective stillness, a discipline forced not by orders, but by the primal knowledge that noise, even the noise of breath, could betray them. The ridge felt strangely alive beneath their bodies, its cold skin rising and falling with each gust, as though urging them to sink further into its shelter. Above, the engines dipped once more toward the valley floor, their path narrowing, their purpose sharpening, and as the shadow swept near again, the world tightened into absolute quiet. The silence held there. Wind rolled down the ridge in uneven pulses as the aircraft banked, its engines grinding through the cold air with a vibration that seemed to pass straight through the soldiers' chests. Frost stung exposed skin, needling into the seams of their uniforms while they hugged the earth more tightly, willing their shapes to dissolve beneath the scattered stones. No bullets fell, no bombs whistled, yet the threat felt sharper than impact. A slow, methodical search from above that measured every disturbance on the ground. Visibility, not firepower, was the enemy here, an unseen line drawn between survival and erasure. Shadows lengthened as the plane angled against the muted sky, its silhouette gliding like a predator surveying open ground. Men squeezed their eyes shut, not because sight mattered, but because closing them made stillness easier. Fear pressed across the ridge with the same weight as the engine hum, settling into the soil around their fingertips. The cold seemed to tighten its grip, turning breath into shallow wisps that dissipated before they could rise high enough to catch the light. It was not the storm or the altitude that threatened them. It was contrast, the simple betrayal of being outlined against terrain that did not match their bodies. Chalk dust coated the edges of rocks, pale enough to reflect even the dim sky, and the dark wool of their coats cut harsh lines against it. That imbalance drew the eye, that imbalance killed. Soldiers sensed this without needing words, each heartbeat sinking to the rhythm of the circling engines as though the sky itself dictated their pulse. Silence became more than caution. It became the only defense they possessed, a fragile shroud stretched thin over their fear. And as the aircraft lowered into another searching pass, the ridge seemed to brace with them beneath the tightening threat. Snow drifted sideways across the ridge as the aircraft pulled momentarily away, giving the soldiers a narrow breath of stillness they scarcely trusted. Frost settled over their sleeves in thin crystalline layers, softening the dark wool, but not enough to erase its contrast against the pale ground. The ridge stretched behind them in broken terraces of chalk and stone, each rise a remnant of earlier shelling, each depression a refuge too shallow to guarantee concealment. France in 1940 offered few advantages to men on retreat, and none to those caught in open terrain beneath a sky controlled by reconnaissance flights. Uniforms had not yet adapted to the demands of aerial warfare. The coats they wore were sturdy, warm, dependable in close combat, but against observation from above they betrayed shapes too clean, too recognizable. Pilots trained to read the landscape like a map of silhouettes could spot those dark patches with unsettling ease. Reports from earlier days had circulated quietly among the unit. Columns discovered, ambushes compromised, supply routes exposed, all traced back to the same flaw. Men who stood out against a terrain that demanded subtlety rather than strength. The soldiers learned to fear exposure more than contact, the threat of being seen outweighing the threat of what followed. Cold chalk dust clung to any surface it touched, turning gloves pale, dulling the shine of metal buckles. Some soldiers wiped it instinctively across their sleeves, as though trying to borrow anonymity from the ridge itself. The gesture was crude, improvised, but rooted in an intuition honed by desperation. Engines echoed again in the distance, the brief silence thinning as the aircraft curved back toward their position. The men pressed deeper into the ground, sensing the stakes tighten with every passing second, and the ridge absorbed their tension like a living thing preparing for the next sweep. Soil shifted beneath their weight as the aircraft swung closer again, its engines carving a low tremor through the ridge that rolled straight into their bones. Dust rose in faint puffs around elbows and knees, settling across sleeves in uneven patches that blurred the sharp edges of fabric. One soldier dug his fingers into the chalky ground, feeling it crumble into a fine powder that clung to his skin, its cold grit forming a pale film over the darker wool. The ridge offered no comfort, only texture. Rough, indifferent, necessary. They pressed deeper into it because the alternative was to stand out, and standing out meant becoming a mark from the sky. Another gust slid across the slope, carrying loose soil in thin ribbons that danced along their helmets before scattering across the fractures in the stone. The motion coated their shapes with a dusting that seemed almost deliberate, as though the earth were trying to claim them moment by moment. Instinct drove a few to smear more of it across their sleeves, grinding chalk into creases, dulling the reflective sheen of damp fabric. There was no guidance for this, no manual or doctrine, only the raw logic of matching themselves to the surface on which they lay. Breath tightened in their chests as the engine note deepened, its pitch signaling another sweep. The men held absolutely still, bodies rigid yet sinking into mud, gravel, and frost. Silence became a physical act, a full-body discipline that required shutting down every impulse except the one that urged them not to exist. Muscles ached under the strain of stillness, but movement felt louder than any scream. The ridge embraced or buried them, they could not tell which, as the aircraft's shadow stretched long across the broken ground once more, and the silence thickened before the next pass. Frost whispered across the ridge as the aircraft veered momentarily aside, granting the soldiers a fragment of breathing room that felt too fragile to trust. Chalk dust still clung to their coats where instinct had driven them to smear it, dulling the dark fabric just enough to soften their silhouettes. One soldier, elbows buried in the soil, studied the pale film along his sleeve and noticed how it erased the hard line of his arm when he held still. The shape disappeared into the ground's uneven palette, a quiet merging that felt accidental at first, then suddenly deliberate. Curiosity flickered through the tension, a slow realization rising beneath the cold. Another shift of wind sent a veil of dust sweeping over the ridge, settling in patches across helmets and shoulders. Wherever the soil gathered, the outlines blurred. Faces pressed into the earth took on the mottled texture of stone. Even the faint shine of buttons dulled beneath the chalk's dry touch. What began as instinct sharpened into understanding. The ground was teaching them how to vanish. Their bodies adapted not through movement, but through subtraction, peeling away contrast until they were no longer shapes, but shadows, no longer soldiers, but fragments of terrain. A corporal near the center of the line lifted a hand coated in pale dust, studying the way the color muted his skin and blended with the ridge's broken tones. He reached for his journal with slow, careful motions, its pages hidden beneath, layers of grit already gathering. Rough sketches formed, lines of soil across fabric, contours broken by texture, the outline of a man dissolving into chalk and frost. It was crude, improvised, but astonishingly effective. Engines crescendoed again as the aircraft returned, and the ridge held its breath with them, aware now that invisibility was not a myth, but a method forming in the silence. Engines rumbled back into the valley as the men pressed themselves even flatter. But something had changed in the moments since their discovery. Chalk dust no longer felt like dirt clinging to fabric. It felt like intent. One soldier dragged both hands through the pale soil, gathering as much as he could before sweeping it across his coat in slow, deliberate motions. The texture scraped against the wool, leaving irregular streaks that fractured the uniform's shape. Another tugged at clumps of frost-bitten grass, crushing it between his palms until it released a muted green tone that he rubbed along the darker patches near his shoulders. They were not adding camouflage so much as borrowing the ground's vocabulary and speaking it through their bodies. A thin wind carried more dust along the ridge, and the men used it, leaning into the drift so the soil settled over their helmets and gloves. Even the smallest glint of metal vanished once rubbed with grit. One soldier pressed a handful of soil against the side of his face, feeling its cold bite as it dulled the skin's reflective sheen. There was no room for hesitation. The aircraft's shadow had begun sliding across the far slope again, its path tracing the land with unsettling accuracy. They worked quickly, silently, with a precision born from fear sharpened into purpose. When the engine note deepened into its familiar searching crescendo, the squad froze. Bodies that once read as human shapes softened into broken patches of chalk and stone. From above, the ridge appeared unchanged. No dark figures, no unnatural lines, only scattered debris and winter earth. The plane circled once, then again, slower each time, as though doubting its own vision. The men remained motionless, breath locked tight, until the sound drifted toward the distant valley floor, and the silence that followed settled over them like a second skin. Silence lingered long after the aircraft drifted out of sight, a stillness so complete that the men hesitated to move, fearing even a shift of gravel might break the fragile invisibility they had earned. Chalk streaks clung unevenly across their coats, gathering in the folds where fabric met stone, while traces of grass and soil muted every recognizable contour. What had begun as desperate instinct moments earlier now felt like a method, primitive, improvised, but undeniably effective. The ridge had accepted them, and in doing so revealed a path of survival none of them had been taught. As they slowly pushed themselves upright, the hardened earth released them like a reluctant protector. Nearby units, alerted by the unusual quiet that followed the sweep, climbed toward the ridge to investigate. They paused mid-step when they saw the men emerging from the ground itself, their forms appearing first as movement within the rubble before resolving into familiar faces streaked with soil. Whispered questions hung in the air without needing answers. The evidence was written across coats and helmets. The ridge had hidden them because they learned to match its silence. Soldiers from other lines gathered close, examining the faded outlines on uniforms, tracing the dusty smears that had erased the harsh contrast of wool against chalk. Word traveled quickly along the defensive positions. Men who had feared every engine note now listened with a different tension, knowing they possessed a tool that cost nothing but awareness. They smeared soil across fabric, pressed frost-damp grass into seams, dusted helmets until their shapes softened into terrain. The technique spread not through command, but through necessity, a quiet doctrine shaped by observation rather than orders. Each new squad that attempted it felt the same astonishment when the ground accepted their presence, and as aircraft began their next distant patrol, the ridge prepared to vanish once more beneath the gathering hush. Wind slipped across the ridge in thin, wandering currents as the men settled back into position, their newly learned method spreading through the ranks with a quiet certainty. Chalk dust coated their sleeves in unpredictable swaths, and the soil's rough texture blended into seams and creases until the distinction between fabric and earth felt almost philosophical. What they practiced was not camouflage as future armies would know it. It was a conversation with the ground itself, an acceptance that survival required harmony rather than defiance. Silence, once a reflex of fear, began to feel like a deliberate state, an understanding that presence could be softened until it no longer called attention to itself. The science behind their concealment lived not in textbooks, but in the simple behavior of light. From above, contrast dictated recognition. A uniform's dark wool formed an unnatural shape against pale stone, attracting the eye of any pilot trained to read terrain like a ledger of shadows. But when soil muted the fabric and texture fractured its outline, light scattered in ways that confused a distant observer, edges dissolved, shadows blended. The idea was primitive yet precise. To survive, they had to let themselves become indistinguishable from the land that carried them. Philosophy crept into their stillness. A soldier who felt exposed before now sensed the ridge absorbing his outline, like water taking the shape of a vessel. The cold no longer felt like an enemy, but a condition of belonging. Breath slowed until it synced with the wind, each inhalation quiet enough to leave no mark. They learned that invisibility was not the absence of being, but the mastery of presence, staying so faithful to the terrain's rhythm that even the sky struggled to betray them. And when the next engine murmur brushed the horizon, the ridge seemed to fold them inward again beneath its widening silence. Snow gathered in shallow pockets along the ridge long after the war moved past it, softening the scars of trenches and shell bursts until only faint depressions hinted at where men once lay pressed into the earth. Decades later, hikers tracing forgotten paths paused near a patch of pale soil where a scrap of wool surfaced each spring, its fibers still holding the ghostly stain of chalk and dust. Most saw it as debris, a remnant of weather rather than survival, but those who studied the early months of the conflict recognized it as something more, a fragment of ingenuity born from necessity, a trace of men who learned to disappear before camouflage existed in any official doctrine. Modern soldiers passing through training grounds spoke of digital patterns, thermal masking, and fabric engineered to scatter wavelengths beyond human sight. They carried gear that blended instinctively with forests, deserts, and stone. Yet even with technology woven into every thread, instructors sometimes referenced older principles: break the outline, mute the shine, learn the land. The wisdom echoed faintly through the years, reaching back to a morning on a chalk ridge when men discovered survival through soil and silence rather than equipment or command. It was not nostalgia that preserved the lesson, but respect for a moment when understanding outweighed invention. Visitors who paused long enough felt the ridge's quiet weight. Wind moved differently across ground that had once sheltered bodies, threading through shallow hollows where men pressed themselves so fully into the earth that even the sky failed to detect them. The silence here seemed thicker, as though carrying the memory of held breath and patient stillness. The terrain had shaped their fate, but they had shaped themselves to meet it, learning that invisibility was less about concealment than about listening. And as clouds drifted low across the valley, the land seemed to whisper the same truth it had offered them once before. Engines groaned faintly along the horizon on the night before the unit withdrew from the ridge, a distant vibration threading through the cold air like a final test of everything they had learned. Soil clung to their coats in dried, powdery constellations, each patch a memory of earlier fear reshaped into purpose. They lowered themselves once more onto the fractured ground, bodies already aligning with the chalk's uneven tones, movements practiced enough to feel instinctive. Frost pressed against their cheeks, grounding them in the ridge's breathless hush as the aircraft angled toward their position. No orders passed between them. The silence held its own command. Wind slid across the slope in thin ribbons, carrying loose grains of dust that settled along their backs, completing the work their hands had begun hours earlier. From above, the soldiers became nothing more than scattered debris, shadows without definition, textures without shape. The aircraft circled, hesitating as though unsure of what the ground concealed. Men who once trembled at the sound now felt a strange calm, understanding that invisibility meant not absence, but belonging. They had ceased to fight the terrain, and instead allowed it to draw them into its muted cadence. A brief break in the clouds cast a pale wash of light across the ridge, revealing no human outline, no uniformed silhouettes, only earth, only silence. The aircraft drifted on, engines fading into the valley like a threat losing its certainty. Slowly, cautiously, the men rose from the soil, emerging as if pulled from the ridge's own memory. They brushed dust from their sleeves with reverent hands, aware that what had saved them was not weapon or strategy, but the willingness to listen to the land. The silence around them deepened, carrying the weight of their survival. If stories like this remind you what endurance really means, subscribe and keep these lessons alive.